People often say power corrupts. It can, but I think power reveals. In the COVID times, it revealed a lot about people who had just a little bit of power and what they were willing to do with it. I mean, you go back in time, mandatory COVID shots, mask mandates for 5-year-olds, police tape around playgrounds, and being in a position at the time where I could actually do something about it, it kind of stirred something. It was really an inflection point in my public service. Mass migration, which is what we had, certainly over the last 4 years, has to be met with mass deportations. Higher ed, in many ways, is kind of like the, I've said before, like it's like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like in 1913. Okay. Like it's about, something's about to happen. I think one of the cool things over the next 20, 30 years would be, what if there's a conservative alternative to that? Now that's gonna take money, it's gonna take talent, it's gonna take some ingenuity. What you guys are doing, and there's other groups out there, that there's really kind of a culture now surrounding this movement, and I think it's really positive. And I think the lesson is, we can't be afraid. We just gotta wade into those big cultural fights and win.
Today, I'm joined by U.S. Senator Eric Schmitt. Senator Schmitt is a former Missouri Attorney General, where he led consequential lawsuits against the Biden administration. A first-term U.S. Senator, Schmitt has emerged as a key ally for President Trump and Vice President Vance in Congress, and is passionate about protecting Americans' freedom, combating mass migration, strengthening our national security, preventing U.S. tax dollars from being wasted on never-ending wars overseas, and restoring American exceptionalism. Senator Schmitt, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Let's start with your background. You're a sixth-generation Missourian. Do you have a family pioneer story, a frontier story, something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the first people, my people came over from Germany in the early 1840s, and so they came over. Actually, we've traced it through the port of New Orleans up to St. Louis, and then the Missouri River then goes east-west. And it was as far west at the time that the riverboats would go or the railroads would go. So it was truly the frontier. And I had somebody ask me one time, is Missouri a northern state, a Midwestern state, a Western state, a Southern state? And I said, yes, because it's like all these things kind of come together. But the truth is, if you really want to understand my state, it really was a Western state. It's always been kind of distrustful of a government 1,000 miles away telling you how to live your life, fiercely kind of independent. And those were my people. They went to, like, the edge of civilization effectively, right? And hacked the soil and made a life out of it. And then my grandfather went off to World War II, came back and settled in the St. Louis area. He was a butcher. My dad worked 7 days a week in the midnight shift at Anheuser-Busch. So very working class kind of background, and in St. Louis area is still my home.
Yeah, I mean, I've often liked to think of the pioneers as living at the edge of the wave. And what we mean by that is that it's this intersection between savagery and civilization. And that's the background that many of us Americans come from.
Well, and I think too, that's interesting about that is, think of the people that came here who had that mindset, right? They left everything they knew. Everybody, their family lineage that had, for 1,000 years, right? Or longer. Everything that they knew, they left it all behind, and they went out as far as you could go. There's a certain kind of mentality that is something that I think we should be really proud of in this country, right? It's something that should be celebrated, this kind of pioneer spirit, this settler mentality, this, I want to see what's on the other side of the mountain. In many ways, kind of fuels this entrepreneurship that's always been kind of uniquely American too, right? It's part of our DNA, really.
Yeah, and it leads to a sort of rootedness. And I mean, obviously, this is your conference room right next to your office, and you've turned it into sort of a shrine to the Cardinals here.
Well, I believe in anchors in your life. And the St. Louis Cardinals are one of those great anchors.
Yeah, and you have some sort of a background in baseball. I was hearing that you were a sort of an all-star on the congressional baseball team.
It's a low bar, but I'll take it.
Yeah, the average age, I guess, is.
Yeah, I bring it down.
We need to bring it down.
Well, the only senator that plays, that should tell you something about the typical age of a U.S. senator. So
yes, can we talk a little bit about COVID-19?
Sure.
So for context, I was actually a college student during COVID-19.
Yeah.
And so I was put through sort of the typical routine of sort of the mask mandates, the remote school, sort of all social activities being shut down. This is a very this is an experience that Gen Z largely went through in high school and in college, and then for older Americans, it was more in the workforce that they went through it. In your book, The Last Line of Defense, you talked about some of the work that you did pushing back against those mandates. There were vaccine mandates, mask mandates, and the rest. What did you learn in that area, in the COVID era, and how does that impacted the way that you sort of, do legislation and policy in general now in this era?
Yeah, it's a big part of the book that I wrote that just came out. And to me, um, people often say power corrupts. It can, but I think power reveals. And in the COVID times, it revealed a lot about people who had just a little bit of power and what they were willing to do with it. I mean, you go back in time a little bit, take the DeLorean back in time a little bit, and like these were the times of, mandatory COVID shots, mask mandates for 5-year-olds, police tape around playgrounds. I mean, you were going through, college. You couldn't walk into a classroom unless you had 8 different cards proving
Yes.
you've been vaccinated, right? Like, this is the kind of stuff you would see somewhere else. And for me, seeing that in America and being in a position at the time where I could actually do something about it, it kind of stirred something. It was really an inflection point in my public service. I felt like somebody needed to do something, and I was in a spot to do it. So we brought that vaccine mandate challenge to the Supreme Court, and we won. We sued 50 plus school districts in Missouri on the peak day of Omicron to get rid of the mask mandates. And to this day, the most frequent comment I'll get, like at the grocery store or something, it's usually a mom will come up and say, "Hey, thanks for fighting for our kids," at a time when not a lot of people were willing to do it.
Well, thank you for your work on that issue. I recall, specific memories, right? On campus, we would get basically corralled, almost like cattle,
Yeah.
to basically go through these biweekly COVID tests, right? And it was really important that at the state level, there were people, as Attorney General like yourself or others, who were fighting back against this stuff.
Well, the polling, you got to
Yeah.
remember too, the polling at the time, if you polled Democrats of how you should handle Americans who refuse to get the vaccine, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, they were talking about sending them off into camps. So it's, we like to think that that we're pretty civilized, but there's a point that was I think very instructive, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, and we're not talking about the book, was that it's a playbook of how you fight back, because it won't be the last time we see that from the left. And what do you do to push back in those moments when it feels like everything, all of the inertia is headed in one direction?
In your NatCon speech last month, you talked about how we are ruled by a fundamentally post-American ruling class.
Yeah.
How do we fight back against them?
Well, it's interesting you talked about roots, the things that draw us. It's a rootless kind of elite managerial class that they're everywhere, but they're not really from anywhere. They feel much more comfortable in Brussels than they do in like Bridgeton, where I grew up. And they have these ideas, and America in many ways is sort of their playground for this leftist agenda, whether it's censorship or whether it's mass migration. They don't really believe in borders. As these globalists, they just sort of believe that everybody's a global citizen and everybody has a right to, government-funded benefits in any American town. And I just reject that. I think that now is the time for us to be sort of unapologetically American.
Yeah.
And we know what that means, and we should fight for it. And we have a group of people in this country and around the world who just don't see it that way. And I think we have to push back against that. And I've sort of used this phrase talking about COVID and this sort of elite ruling class that I've started to use. It's not 2020 anymore. I think, in that era where the left was really on the march, and they're kind of in retreat now. We still have with Trump's victory, I think, and the fever breaking in November of last year. They're in retreat, not gone. And we still see these left-wing networks and NGOs still doing a lot of damage and sowing chaos. But they had their moment of what it really looked like if they were in charge. And that's when you saw the summer of love and the rioting, and you saw the mass migration and what Biden sort of opened up the gates for 20 million people who came here illegally in just 4 years' time. So that's the world. And I think that they want. And he surrounded himself in many ways in that administration of these, gender study majors from Ivy League institutions who were writing white papers about open borders. And suddenly they were in charge of the country.
Yes.
And we saw how bad that can be. And I think the American people rejected it, thankfully.
Yeah, the left has had this expert class that has essentially ruled us for decades now. How do we on the right cultivate an expert class that is better? And I would argue the left's expert class has been extremely discredited across, say, the COVID era was particularly illuminating for many people, but we've also seen it on the migration question, or just when they started to trans young people and things like that. It's something we think about a lot at New Founding. We're a right of center venture capital firm. How do we build a new generation of actual experts who are looking out for the best interest of Americans? And how do we do that on the right?
I think that one of the great lessons, and I think honestly, one of President Trump's great legacies when people write, the history books about his time this last decade, is just sort of the courage to wade into the fight. I think speaking as a Republican, that wasn't the ethos of the Republican Party for a long time, and now I think you've got this sort of new right who feels very emboldened to say we're proud of this country. We're not going to apologize anymore. We're going to fight for it. We believe in things that really matter. And I think we'll take this as an example of kind of how this debate has evolved over time. When I was in college, I was always, been a bit of a contrarian, but and I was always pretty conservative. I was always a little envious of liberals on their kind of had the high ground on free speech. They kind of were the ones that were unapologetic about. Not anymore. I mean, they lost the plot a long time ago. So that's an opportunity, I think, for us, and especially what we saw when the left had power during the Biden administration, how they were willing to censor people and use government to sort of go after their political enemies. I think that we have the high ground now, and now that it's been exposed, I just think that what you guys are doing, and there's other groups out there, that there's really kind of a culture now surrounding this movement, and I think it's really positive. And people, I think the lesson is we can't be afraid. We just got to wade into those big cultural fights and win.
You mentioned censorship or opposition to free speech from the left, and I think where we've seen the most of that has actually been big tech.
Yeah.
And you led a case at the state level in Missouri against basically big tech, Missouri v. Biden, looking at collusion between the Biden administration and big tech. We've seen big tech roll back censorship to some extent in recent months and years, right? Twitter, Instagram, and the rest, there's a little bit less censorship there. And we've also seen around the time of the inauguration, the big tech leaders sort of kissed the ring. They sort of rallied around Trump, at least in public rhetoric or in their gifts and whatnot. So I'm curious, do you think big tech are they still an enemy? Are they an ally? Like, what's our relationship like today with big tech?
It's a great question that I don't know that I have the complete answer to yet. I think it's sort of like TBD. Have they been red pilled? Is this just expediency? I don't know. You could probably debate it on either side. Yeah. My hope, though, is that if you trace this thing, in many ways, you could go back to the sort of the Russia collusion hoax, right? And people blamed Russia, which was a totally made up story. And then there was Facebook. Facebook was the reason why President Trump got into office. And so Facebook then sort of felt like they needed to do something and got on board with this kind of resistance movement and censoring conservatives. And then when Biden came in, what we uncovered in that lawsuit was pretty shocking. Day 3 of the administration, they already started to silence people like RFK Jr., Tucker Carlson, voices, on the right who had different points of view on COVID or the election or Hunter Biden laptop story. That's really Orwellian. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, it ought to scare the bejesus out of you, the idea that the government had that much power. I mean, they were so bold as they were going to start a disinformation governance board in the United States of America. They were going to the government was going to determine what the truth was. And they still hide behind these terms of misinformation and disinformation. And I think we have to continue to push back. I'm glad, I suppose, to see that they've admitted their role in it all, and that they're, re-platforming people that were deplatformed. But the proof will be in the pudding, long term. Is this a real thing, or is it just because President Trump's in office and they want to make nice?
I'm curious where you think we can be most effective against the left. Maybe if there's a young person who's listening, right, you can imagine a number of different pathways. You could go into local government, state level government, federal government. There's also sort of executive versus legislative versus going to the judicial route. Mm-hmm. Where do you think we're going to get the most wins over the next decade? You, of course, had a lot of success at the state level. You're now in the U.S. Senate, so you're in the legislative, sort of federal side of things. Where would you encourage people to focus their attention?
I think for everybody, it's a different path. For me, it was, the law, and then being an attorney general and kind of being a disruptor in many ways. So I feel very much at home now with this administration. Yeah. And, President Trump and Vice President Vance and the cabinet. That is, I feel really good about where the country's headed because of it. But as far as every individual who's maybe listening or watching, what their role is, it's going to be an individual decision. I would say this though, that for a long time, the left has dominated these big cultural institutions. I mean, they've waded into it. I mean, conservatives in many ways were off like creating companies and that's great. Like we should continue to do those things. But whether it's like the media or the film industry or higher ed or even now K through 12, like they just gravitated and they sort of took these cultural institutions over. And I think we can't cede anything. And again, with the book, my point with the book was that we can't see the legal the legal profession is dominated by people who lean more to the left and to the right. So I've always kind of operated in that world, but we did cultivate a group of people who can now be appointed by President Trump to very important positions on the bench. That's a very important thing. So I think whether it's just sort of just a network of people who are like-minded who can feel comfortable having conversations, or it's I think wading into media. I mean, you look at the dominance. I mean, this is just my own personal musing. The dominance on what's on Netflix or what's on these platforms or what's produced in Hollywood is just overwhelmingly left. You can't even hardly watch an awards show now. Like it's just ridiculous. I think one of the cool things over the next 20, 30 years would be, what if there's a conservative alternative to that? Now that's going to take money. It's going to take talent. It's going to take some ingenuity. It's going to take telling stories in a different way. One of the great exports we always had about, again, this American identity that somehow is now controversial, but never was until the last few years, is the American Western. Like, think of all the things of value that were portrayed with the cowboy, like this independence, this self-sufficiency. And we don't make Westerns anymore, right? Like, it's just all woke nonsense and bullshit. So anyway, so maybe we can get to that. We have an alternative that can help people see a pathway through. But I will say this, one of the most encouraging things that I've seen over the last few years, part of it's COVID, part of it is these cultural institutions dominated by the left telling particularly young men that they're the root of all the problems in the world, and they need to go through DEI struggle sessions and all this like privilege walks and all this nonsense. There's a serious backlash.
Yes.
And for good reason, because that is un-American. I mean, we believe in this idea that like, there's a lot of things about me, like I'm Catholic, I'm a Cardinals fan, I like Busch beer, I like barbecue. Like there's a lot of things that define me. And this idea that the left has, that there's this one immutable characteristic, your race, that defines everything about you, is being rejected. And so I do think that's a positive sign. And young men in particular, but young people, you look at how they identify. You're seeing more people come to faith. You're seeing more people be more conservative. You saw record numbers of people vote for President Trump. There's a lot of reasons for all that, but my hope is that seeing the excesses of the COVID era and the Biden era has now made the younger generation more conservative, and that's a good thing for the country.
Yeah, I believe that that's all true. I think young people especially are turning increasingly to Christianity, increasingly to the right, and increasingly believe in a sort of a positive assertion of American identity and values and such. So I'm very optimistic about the future there. Can we turn to migration?
Yeah.
You fought again at the state level to defend the Remain in Mexico policy, sort of the early years of the Biden administration. That was an important policy to maintain border security. Again, I'll sort of speak from personal experience here. Growing up in the early 2000s and such, we sort of watched many of our hometowns as young people become just completely flooded by immigrants. Can you talk to me some about like what do we do from here practically? Like how can we actually fix the problem that exists in this country related to the number of unassimilated immigrants, often who are illegal, here in our communities?
Yeah, well, I think mass migration, which is what we had, certainly over the last 4 years, has to be met with mass deportations. And you notice like the resistance you have and the firebombing and violence being perpetrated on ICE agents. This is the left's sort of like death quiver on this. They understand what that means. Like you have a president now and you have a country. You look at the polling now versus like 15 years ago, how they view the issue of immigration. The American people get it right. They understand in common sense that you can't have those numbers flood a community, what it does to cost of living, what it does to just sort of the community altogether. I mean, you just can't do it. It doesn't work anywhere. And Europe is by far and away the best cautionary tale you have, whether it relates to censorship or mass migration. I mean, that's why everybody's talking about what's going on in these European countries. They just can't survive, but they don't have the political will to do something about it. We do in this moment of time now have the political will to do something about it, and that's being carried out. We, in the Senate and the Congress and the One Big Beautiful Bill, we front loaded, because we know the Democrats hold us hostage, we front loaded a lot of that money for detention facilities, deportations, and more ICE agents. Like, that's a real commitment to meet mass migration with mass deportations. And I think also we have to be kind of unafraid to talk about, not just, illegal immigration, but also some of the flaws and the abuses with the legal immigration system that we have right now. H-1B, I mean, I talked about it in that speech too. Where I grew up, in a working class neighborhood, the people that I grew up around were hit with this sort of double whammy, which was those blue collar jobs were shipped to China and other places. Terrible idea to include them in the World Trade Organization. Those jobs are shipped to China. And then as they go out and look for different jobs, they're now competing with lower wage, lower skilled workers who are imported into this country, right? Like, that's patently unfair to the people who dealt with that. Now what you see, which is what's interesting about this H-1B issue, is white collar workers, right? These are not like, if the idea behind the program is to have the best and the brightest and the few of them come in to handle jobs we don't, okay, you can have some sort of merit to that, maybe. But that's not what's happening. Like, these are a lot of people coming to take American jobs. In many ways, older Americans or Americans that are paid more than what they can pay the H-1B folks who are coming in are training their replacements in the humiliation of just so they can get their severance. Like, that's the kind of abuse with the legal immigration system that we have to have the courage to address too.
One piece of the visa question is actually student visas. And this is something that's very top of mind, I would say, for, again, maybe students during the COVID era. Many of the sort of Ivy League and adjacent type universities were pressing up towards close to 30% foreign students. And there's a few different things to think about there. I mean, one is you basically, that's fewer spots for Americans, right, or people like from Missouri who are sort of those young working class types, or even guys like J.D. Vance who would otherwise be getting into those places. But then there's also sort of this cultural question, like, what does that do to the campus culture and the way that people interact with each other? What do you think about the student visa issue? And any thoughts on basically solutions there?
Yeah, there's certainly being abused. The other aspect too, I would just add a third leg to that stool, which is typically they'll pay full freight.
Yeah.
So there's a greed aspect too with higher ed right now, as they've had these DEI policies that were struck down by the Supreme Court for a long time, but they want to get the money from a lot of these foreign students who are coming from places like China, whose families are members of the CCP, and they're in an engineering program, right, at Harvard or wherever, and they're paying full freight. So there's a lot of greed. There's a lot of reform. And I think there's a reason why, by the way, you see a cultural shift of where students are going. Like, higher ed in many ways is kind of like the, I've said before, like, it's like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like in 1913.
Okay.
Like, it's about, something's about to happen.
That's not good.
No, I know. Like, something's going to happen.
Right. Famously, the military in that period had like 8 different languages being used, which is kind of what it's like being on campus
and
today.
It's like, it's sort of hollowed out, and it doesn't really work like it's supposed to, but I don't know what comes next.
Yes.
But something's going to happen. But you see now, like, just look at, Missouri happens to be in the SEC, right? Like, you see like the applications at SEC schools now in, the Midwest to the Southeast region. They're getting a lot of people because there's something cultural about it too. It's a good education, but it's cultural. I think people are rejecting this idea that you're going to go to that the only pathway to success is to somehow be at an Ivy League institution. Right. And again, who are teaching the values that we talked about, the global elites. Like, many of those people, there's no connection to America with these professors who are tenured there, who can say whatever they want to say about how terrible America is all the time. And look, I believe in freedom of speech. We can have a point of view. We don't have to celebrate it. We can object to it. We can counter it. So I think there's a rejection that's happening, just sort of to the extent there's a market force in higher ed. Some of that's people are moving a little bit with their feet, but clearly the student visa issue is being abused for a number of reasons. And I also wouldn't, like I said, financial reasons are part of it too.
What are your policy priorities for the rest of this year? And what is your long-term vision for America?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in Washington. I got a chance to, which is unusual for first-term senator, to handle the rescissions package, which was a lot of fun. And I think having the relationships in the White House and also with my Senate colleagues, and I think, being a more conservative member was a lot of fun. It clawed back a lot of this wasteful spending that people like back home in Missouri, like, why are we spending money on Guatemalan sex changes? And why are we sending billions to DEI training in Burma? And why are we paying for Sesame Street in Iraq? All this ridiculous stuff, principally through USAID, which we could talk about why that is and it should be a punching bag, because it's like the globalist sort of money laundering scheme for a lot of these left-wing NGOs. But there's no line item for it. It just gets abused, and then you try to catch on the back end, and we rescinded the money. So I think, government waste, having a forward-looking trade policy, and also a foreign policy so this kind of dovetails into the future, I think, of the country. I think we're at a really cool time in American history, and it's hard with the day-to-day news to pull yourself. But if you think about it, what the American people just did was something very historic. They sent a president who had been out of office for 4 years back in to disrupt the establishment. That's the lesson, I think. He's a very unique character and a singular political figure on the stage, and always has been since he came down the escalator. But the American people rejected the excesses. They've also said we have a wandering foreign policy, this Wilsonian view that we can be everywhere all at once all the time and sort of import our values anywhere in the world, and they're going to become American. That's just not true. And I think the American people understand it. They rejected it. Also, trade policy. So after the Cold War ended, well, think about it. From World War II to the end of the Cold War, America had, on trade policy and foreign policy, we wanted our European allies and Japan to get back up on their feet. So we had some of these unfavorable deals, and we were paying almost exclusively for NATO protection. But there was never an adjustment after the Cold War, right? We never renegotiated those deals, and we never said, Europe, you have to pay your fair share. And that's what's happening right now. So it's a really interesting time and fun time to be in government, to watch this happening, to play a role in that. And I think if we do those things right, we're setting the stage for, I think, a golden age for America. And you've got people like yourself and your audience, who is, generally speaking, not exclusively, a younger audience that really wants to see America do well. And what the left can't stand, and why you see what's happening on the Democrat side, they don't have a messenger, they don't have a leader. And what they have is a really radical leftist base now that fundamentally doesn't love this country. That's the truth. And if we understand that, and you understand all the landscape of how they come at us at higher ed or in lawsuits or all these sorts of things, DEI, critical race theory, trying to indoctrinate our kids, if you understand that, we can fight back. Yeah. But you got to have the guts to do it.
Well, Senator Schmitt, thank you for your work fighting against the left in the the darker years of the Biden administration and COVID. And thank you for your work continuing to advance that golden age of positive vision. Really appreciate you joining the New Founding podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs early-stage startups focused on critical civilizational problems. If you're interested in pitching your company or investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture and follow the link to apply. You can also follow us on X @newfounding and @NAT Halberstadt, HALBERSTADT.